Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by ponds and water gardens, spending countless days building them for family and friends whenever I had the chance. These ranged from small garden ponds to huge 40-foot wildlife ponds and everything in between. I was hooked on the idea of creating spaces where water and life came together. 2 years ago, when my girlfriend and I moved into our first ever home, the very first project I took on was building my dream koi pond. I was so excited to start the project that I'd spent weeks planning every detail before we even got the keys, so by the first weekend of us being in our home, I could start getting the garden ready and having the pond taking shape just days later. The neighbours must have thought that I'd completely lost it, digging the pond and turning the whole garden into a bomb site within days of moving in. But I had no choice. Moving into our home in the late summer turned the pond project into a race against the clock. Winter wasn't far off, and the koi in my mum's tiny pond needed a proper home before the cold set in. Everything else, like the landscaping and finishing touches, could simply wait until later on. Once the koi were safely in and settled, the rest of the pond project had to take a back seat while we focused on renovating the house. And with winter closing in, it felt like the right time to press pause. The whole aim of this 12,000 litre pond was to create a water garden that felt natural, with rocks and pebbles, waterfalls and wildlife corners, whilst also giving the koi everything they need to thrive. This meant high flow rates, plenty of aeration and a serious filtration setup, so I could feed them heavily and really try to push their growth. A system with a blend between beauty and performance. By mid-spring, the final tasks of tackling the path, waterfall and wildlife pond were all complete. What began as a fresh new pond in spring quickly transformed, and by summer it was a living, breathing space. The koi were thriving. Around them, the small wildlife pond had grown into a mini oasis, lilies stretching across the surface, plants softening the edges, and the waterfall bringing that constant calming sound. Dragonflies hovered over the water, occasionally landing to leave their eggs amongst the plants. Birds stopped by for a drink, and occasionally a frog would appear near the water's edge. The garden felt almost complete, the plants, the waterfall and the wildlife all thriving, but there was one thing missing: more colour. The koi that called the pond home were garden centre gradefish, still loved of course, but I wanted to start getting some high quality Japanese koi that are carefully selected for their vibrant colours, striking patterns, body shapes and size potential, to really bring the pond to life. The search took me on a bit of a journey, not just for the right fish, but to really understand what separates an ordinary koi from a truly special one. I spent quite a lot of time learning to appreciate the subtle details, the depth of colour, the balance of pattern, and the way the fish's frame would carry it into the future. But it wasn't just about finding the perfect fish. It was also about finding them at the right price and seeing the potential in smaller koi that could grow and develop over time. For me, that's part of the project. Raising koi and watching them transform, rather than just buying them already at their peak. Eventually, the right koi appeared, and bringing them home felt like a huge step forward for the whole pond. With the addition of these new koi, the pond felt brighter and more alive than ever. The long summer evenings felt calm yet full of life, and by the end of summer, the pond had become a place of daily ritual, hand feeding the koi, watching them glide just beneath the surface, and soaking up the last warm evenings before the colder months ahead. Last winter had passed without any major issues, the koi and pond coping well with the cold. Saying that though, this year we added a simple DIY polytunnel to protect the pond from the worst of the winter. The protective canopy stretched over the decking, pond and wildlife pond. Its main purpose isn't to heat the pond as such, but to shelter it from the biting wind and keep the temperatures a little more stable, reducing the subtle stresses and illnesses that can be triggered indirectly by the cold temperatures. Over winter, the weather tested the polytunnel, with the storms battering against it on multiple occasions. But it held firm, keeping the pond sheltered and a few degrees warmer. Whatever was happening outside, I always had a spot where I could sit out of the weather and enjoy the pond. The koi moved lazily beneath the surface, the plants lay dormant, and everything seemed to pause, waiting for spring. As spring returned, the pond began to breathe life again. Warmer days brought fresh growth around the edges, and the koi grew more active, rising eagerly for food as their appetite returned. Once I felt the pond was up to the challenge, it was time to focus on koi growth. As the days warmed up, feeding steadily increased. To me, it felt really heavy, but in truth, it was modest compared to what the real koi enthusiasts push. The large increase in feeding turned into a test for the system itself. My pond isn't built like a serious koi grow-on setup, stripped back and engineered for extreme feeding. Instead, it's more of a garden pond with high-end filtration, but with one potential weak link: the suction grid. This is a network of perforated pipes hidden under the pebbles, acting as the filter's inlet and drawing water down through the natural-looking floor before it enters the filters. It's a design I've trusted time and time again for ponds where a natural look is essential, as also it does a great job of minimising dead spots along the floor. This year I pushed the food at 200 grams a day, and at the very end of summer I upped it to 300. To my relief, the system held up beautifully. Water parameters stayed spot on, clarity was crystal, and there was no waste building up on the bottom. I think that adding some sinking food helped too. As the koi sifted through the pebbles in search of the food, they stirred up anything that might have otherwise settled, keeping the grid flowing well. This meant I barely had to do any maintenance at all, which suited me fine, since most of my extra time was spent working on my dad's pond rebuild, making it similar to mine, but bigger. By the end of summer, I was curious to see what kind of growth the koi had put on. Day to day you hardly notice, but when I compared them to old clips, the difference was a lot more than I thought. Looking back at these 2 years, it's amazing how much has changed. Not just in the pond itself, but in the koi also, that now feel like part of the family. The whole journey has been so much more rewarding than I could have ever imagined, giving me a space I enjoy every day, a hobby that constantly teaches me something new, and all the friendships that I've made along the way. And while the pond is in a great place now, this is just the beginning. As the plants grow, the fish mature, and new ideas come along, there'll always be something to look forward to. Thanks for being part of this journey. I can't wait to share what comes next.